and literature and history, and has written tons of books, and is a Potter fan. So she's totally appropriate to speak to us today. So I ask that you give her a round of applause. It's such a delight to be here with you this evening. And before I begin, I just want to congratulate the Potter Watch on a fantastic conference. This has been a wonderful experience, and well done. And hope that this is the first. And thank you so much. I know I'm what stands between you and dinner, so thanks for sticking with me here. My grandfather gave me my first copy of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And I remember vividly being called into his home office, which was like sort of a place of mystery to me. He was a scientist and an engineer, and at the time I didn't really understand what he did, and I still don't understand what he did. But I thought it was very big to be called in. And he had two really thick books in his hand. He said, I want to give you something. I want to share these with you. I really love them. And so he handed out these books. And that meant a lot to me because this was something that meant a lot to him. And he was sharing it with me. And as he held out the books, I remember this look crossed his face. Like suddenly it dawned on him that here he was, this scientist and engineer, and he was admitting to loving these books. And here was a picture of an elf and a dwarf and a hobbit and a big dragon on the front. And he kind of caught himself and said, I loved them when I was young. Well, I was a successful graduate of the 2nd grade. I didn't need somebody's kitty-lit handoffs, and so I was suddenly completely underwhelmed by this offer that my grandfather was making. Of course, I was polite because he was my grandfather, and I said thank you, and reached out to take the books. Fortunately for me, my grandmother came in, completely without any sense of irony, no attempt at any kind of turnaround psychology or anything. She said, Jack, you can't give those to her. That's not appropriate reading for a girl her age. There's monsters and wars, and somebody gets his finger bitten off. Well, okay, so at that point I decided no one was going to keep me from reading those books. And so I credit my grandfather with giving me my copies, but I credit my grandmother with the fact I actually read them. And I realized looking back that the debate that they were having, and they had it for quite a while after I actually had books in hand, was something that continues to go on today, something that plagues J.K. Rowling. The question of what is appropriate thematic literature for a child, what is appropriate genre literature for an adult. Although Rowling's Harry Potter novels have redefined commercial literary success, there's no clear consensus about who the proper reader for Harry Potter books really is. There's a school of thought that says that these books are unsuitable for young people. In '98, the Harry Potter books came to the US, and by 2000, they topped the American Library Association's most challenged books list, and in fact became one of the top 10 books challenged in that entire decade, even though they'd only been out for 2 years. And they are, together, represent the most challenged book in the United States of the 21st century, as ranked by the American Library Association. There's a group of people whose religious convictions suggest that fantasy literature of any kind is not appropriate reading, and I'm kind of setting them aside because they're not pointing out Harry Potter in general. But there's a whole lot of people who buy that fantasy literature is all right for children, but they single out the Harry Potter series and say that is unsuitable for young people. In the article, Controversial Content in Children's Literature, Is Harry Potter Harmful to Children?, Deborah Todd and Heather Savati find that, quote, objections to the book stem from their controversial content, from the centrality of magic, to the topic of death, to scenes that some believe are too violent, intense, or scary for children. In the USA Today column, Some Want Harry to Vanish Till Kids Are Older, Deidre Donahue looks at booksellers who've taken it on as a kind of personal mission to ask people when they buy the books, what age reader are you buying this book for? Independent booksellers such as Diane Garrett, who is profiled in this piece, warn parents that Harry Potter books are completely inappropriate, Garrett's words, for their small children, and they take it as a kind of personal crusade. In her undeniably positive analysis of Harry Potter, Jan Lacoste, in her work Of Magicals and Muggles, Reversals and Revulsions of Hogwarts, describes the paradox of supposed children's series dealing with subjects often closed or even prohibited to young readers. She writes, "The Harry Potter series incorporates several topics that are more or less taboo to children. Violence, gross and disgusting topics, magic and witchcraft, and the concept of evil, as well as evil incarnate. Young readers find all of these rather enticing, as anything that adults consider off limits must be worthwhile." It's like me and The Hobbit there. If you buy that, if the subject matter, such as death, and the means by which it's discussed, such as violence, are inappropriate for children, then you would think it would follow that the critics would say, well, obviously then it should be adults who should be reading Harry Potter series. There's a whole other school of criticism that suggests this isn't the case. Just like critics of content object to the so-called adult subjects, critics of genre object to the so-called childish wrappings of fantasy in which the Harry Potter series is placed. So you have people like William Safire, who writes, "The trouble is that grown-ups are buying these books ostensibly to read to kids, but actually to read for themselves." He complains, "These are not books for adults. This is not just dumbing down, it is a growing down. Prize-worthy culture it ain't. More than a little is a waste of adult time." Yale professor Harold Bloom, one of my favorite people, not, writes, "Why read if what you read will not enrich your mind or spirit or personality?" He goes on to consider all the classic works that he considers to be the canonical texts of Western civilization, and he laments that the fact that the J.K. Rowling series has reached such success will drain people's energy and take their attention away from what he considers to be great works. And he goes on to say, "The cultural critics will, soon enough, introduce Harry Potter into their college curriculum, and the New York Times will go on celebrating another confirmation of the dumbing down it leads and exemplifies." Here's the point at which I should apologize personally for the downfall of Western civilization, since I've been teaching Harry Potter class at the university for a long time. Philip Hincher, when reading Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix for review in his column, found himself thinking, I quote, "With shame and intensity, Jesus, I'm reading a book about sawing pixies." In the case of Harry Potter, he says, "The feeling of mild embarrassment for the adult reader is never far away." This has even infected that last bastion of wildness and craziness, undergraduate students. When the last book came out, Craig Stern at the University of Southern California wrote in his school paper, "I'd like to take this opportunity to provide a little reality check for USC students who seem to be a little too enraptured with the Harry Potter series. Harry Potter is for children. It is a series of children's books." He says his classmates risk the problem of becoming completely lame, his words. He says, "We are adults in a respectable institution of higher learning. It's time we stopped deluding ourselves and reading these books." Such opinions are so widespread that Bloomsbury Publishing put out a separate set of Harry Potter books with muted covers so that adults could read them in public and not be identified as reading Harry Potter. So there's two things that we're supposed to read with blank covers to protect ourselves: pornography and Harry Potter. It's socially unacceptable in public. Okay, so what do we do with this? Inextricable from these authors' judgments about the quality or complexity or future longevity of Rowling's writings are suppositions about the nature and the purpose of fantasy literature. All betray a certain view of fantasy in the same way that all the concerns about age appropriateness of the books reflects a particular perspective about childhood and children and what those things mean. The days in, then, a difficult question emerges from these disparate lines of fire. If children are supposed to read these stories with these topics, and adults aren't supposed to read these works with this genre, who, if anybody, is supposed to be reading Harry Potter? For an answer, I go to someone I go to all the time for answers to everything, J.R.R. Tolkien. And he would say, I believe, that the the solution to this dilemma lies not in discovering some completely new category of readers that have somehow never been discovered before, but rather in dismissing the false assumptions about children, adults, and the nature of fantasy that undergirds both of those lines of fire against Rowling. But first, I must backtrack for a moment. In 1908, a great essay called The Ethics of Elfland, G.K. Chesterton reflects, quote, "My first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learned in the nursery. The things I believed most then, the things I believe most now, are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be the entirely rational things." 40 years later, Tolkien writes his amazing essay that is slathered in awesome sauce called On Fairy Stories. Came out in 1947, and that's his defense of this entire genre. The way Tolkien defines fairy stories, basically for a four-part definition. First, fairy stories touch on fairy, on this perilous realm, this idea of magic of a certain potency and power and mood. To go back to pornography, it's one of those things like pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. When Galadriel says, I sang of leaves of gold, and leaves of gold there grew. Of wind I sang, a wind there came, and its branches blew. That's fairy. You just know it. That's there. It's a certain mood and power, this perilous realm. Another thing, fairy stories in general take magic seriously. The work might be light, it might be humorous, it might be in some way satirical, but the magic itself isn't the butt of the joke. The magic itself is serious and can have serious repercussions and ripple effects. Third, a fairy story has to involve human beings. It can't be, for example, a beast fable. So Wind in the Willows, not a fairy story. It has to involve people that we recognize as us. And it also has to involve something, what he calls primal human needs. Things that we find when we look at all world cultures and look at their folk tales and their oral stories, the things that have come down in all major civilizations that express a yearning that we have in common as human beings. For example, things like conversing with animals, things like defying gravity, things like being able to overcome time, maybe even lengthen our lives. These things we see over and over and over again as repeated themes, these primal human desires. And most importantly, fairy stories offer us four gifts: fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. And it's in discussing these four gifts that Tolkien's most energetic and passionate defense of the genre lies. The first gift is fantasy, and that's the seductive creation of an internally consistent secondary universe that's arrestingly strange and different from our world, but nevertheless we can believe in it because it sets up its own rules and is internally consistent. He realizes that most people in his day, certainly in ours, kind of think of that in a depreciative way. They take that for granted, and I think it's kind of, to quote my USC student, lame, right? It's something make-believe that people who don't grow up do. And he says that's couldn't be farther from the truth. It's not irrational. It's the most rational thing a person could possibly do, because first you have to understand the ordered patterns of our universe. Then you have to come up with completely different rules that would bind another universe. And then you have to define them so clearly that the reader or viewer or listener, whatever kind of text you're creating, isn't confused between where one ends and the other begins, knows how these worlds work, knows that they're internally consistent, and can hold them separate in their head. He goes on to say that the author or creator or artist in her truest and most fundamental form is acting his idea as a child of God, driven to create just as she herself is created. So in that sense, Tolkien is seeing this as a spiritual as well as an intellectual achievement, and a difficult one at that. And this leads him to say, when he's thinking about what you have to do to create fantasy, that it is, I think, not a lower, but a higher form of art. indeed the most nearly pure form, and so, when achieved, the most potent. So he puts a lot of emphasis on this particular gift. Recovery is the idea of not having a childlike perspective, but a childish. Actually, I just switched that, didn't I? Not a childish perspective, but a childlike perspective, in the sense that you step away from your world and come back having regained a clear view. The opportunity to take a bit of vacation from what seems commonplace and mundane, so that when you see it, you're refreshed and you get to see it again. Another of the gifts is escape. He sees that as a temporary, an alternate outlet for what he calls the fugitive spirit. When we get sort of nickeled to pieces, or nickel and dimed, or however you want to say that, by really small things that aren't all that important, but you get one, and then you get another, and then you get another worry, and they all sort of pile up. Sometimes you just need an escape valve to be able to come back and deal with reality. And he says this is that opportunity for escape for the prisoner, so that they can actually then come back a whole person. But the most important gift is consolation. Consolation is twofold. First, most obvious, most immediate, while you're reading or watching or listening to, say reading, say this is a text. When you're reading, you're happy. It's a good experience, the actual act of consuming this text. So in that sense, you're consoled. But in a bigger sense, his consolation is what he calls the eucatastrophe, a word he kind of puts together. It's a happy ending, but it's more than that. It doesn't suggest that there isn't bad stuff, dark stuff happening, sorrow or failure. In fact, Tolkien says that the possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. You have to have that darkness for the light to come after to mean anything. Darkness has to precede light. Otherwise, the reader wouldn't value a joyous turn, which is what the eucatastrophe means, a joy as poignant as grief. So there's the immediate consolation of feeling good while you're reading this, and then there's this lasting moment where we can be touched by a hope unlooked for, a joyous turn, that light after the darkness. Now, here again, his literary theories is interwoven with his Roman Catholicism, because he sees that if you do the eucatastrophe right, you actually see something really lasting, something, a glimpse of what is big T true, right? But for our purposes, it's enough to understand that Tolkien believes fairy stories are capable of offering sophisticated, serious, even life-changing benefits to the reader. That's really important stuff if they can give you the glimpse of that big T truth. So it follows, he says, that all of these gifts shouldn't be relegated to one age group or another. In fact, he notes that fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation are particularly suitable as gifts for adult readers, as they are, and I quote, all things of which children have, as a rule, less need than older people. So he challenges adults to ignore the capricious fads of popular sentiment, and he exhorts us to, quote, read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature.